really my entire civil rights career came out of my upbringing. I was born and raised in the Appalachian region of Virginia, right there along the Virginia-West Virginia border. And, you know, and obviously, I did not look like the vast majority of Appalachians. I was born to Pakistani parents, you know, nominally Muslim, at least self-identified as such. And I just remember that the region in which I was raised, you know, people didn't know what Pakistan was. They didn't even really know what India was. They thought that, you know, if you had Cherokee blood, you were Indian and you came from some region called India. They understood the black-white binary very well. The community in which I was raised, we were always trying to, like, out black people, you know. We always were suspicious that if you were a little bit olive-skinned, you might just have a touch in you. And it was very predominantly people who looked white. People would look at their hair, look at their features, look at something and say, you know what, I got a question about that person. You know, it was not just racist. They were always trying to find people at whom they could project their racism. And, you know, I got called a nigger more times than I could even count. You know, nigger, jungle bunny, coon, everything imaginable. Why this bill is so offensive, you know, at least people back in Virginia, if somebody called me a nigger, they had the decency to say it to my face. I knew they were a bigot, and I knew what I was dealing with. What is so, I can't even imagine the audacity of the proponents of this legislation to call me a nigger to my face and then to act like you didn't. I mean, don't call me a nigger to my face and act like you didn't. You did. That's what this bill does. It says, Amara, you are, I really shouldn't keep on saying this, but, you know, Amara, you're a nigger. You're always going to be a nigger. You're 3/5 of a person, and you're lucky if we even give you that. Let's talk about what this movement's about. It's about our fear and our loathing of the Islamic people. And that's not based upon our religious practices, our religious beliefs. It's based on the fact that we have brown skin and funny sounding names, and they're scared of us.
And we've got a memo here from the sponsor of the bill, Representative Swanger, who says she's particularly concerned about Sharia law being imposed on all Americans. Sharia is just an Arabic word, and it's a set of principles and guidelines that Muslims follow.
I mean, when you read Rosemary Swanger's memo, it's not just the references to Sharia law that concern me. The nativist rhetoric flows throughout that memo, that America's being overtaken by a set of foreigners. This fear cannot drive Pennsylvania legislation.
The echoes for me are strong of Germany in the 1930s, when repeatedly Jewish law was brought forward and defamed in the courts as a means of defaming all of Jewish tradition. If one system of law is being focused on and is being defamed in our country, why is it happening? What could be the purpose for such focus, and what could be the ramifications for such focus?
These same anti-Sharia laws are being introduced by a small group of people whose sole intent is to demonize Islam and make Islam and American Muslims a wedge issue, a political wedge issue.
Immediately after 9/11, the questions were, why do they hate us? Mm-hmm. Why do they? And now it's like, why do you?
Right.
And so the they was a foreign thing. It was, you know, people from Afghanistan, or even though that's wrong and misguided, it was still a foreign thing. Why does Al-Qaeda hate us? Why do terrorists? Yeah. Why do Muslim terrorists hate us? And that's a fair question to have. I mean, that's fine. And I felt that the discourse was despite the fact that it was right after, it was more intelligent. Now is why do you hate us? What do you believe in?
I remember actually feeling no difference in my day-to-day life. I ran my errands, I went to class, whatever, and there was a gentleman who had also attended the law school. He was of Egyptian ancestry, but even though he was from Egypt, he probably would have been perceived as African-American in that part of the country. But he talked about how, he can't go anywhere. Every time he went places, people were like, hey, you dirty Arab, go home, and all these kinds of things.
One of my first childhood experiences with Islamophobia. I was in 6th grade, and it was the last day of school. I believe it was June 1st or 2nd, one of those first few days of June. And I remember I was excited about the last day of school. You usually have like a party, and people sign yearbooks and bring cookies and things like that. And it was early morning. I was getting ready, and my mom came down to my room and had a quiver in her voice, and she said, "The masjid, the mosque, it's totally burned down. It's gone." And I didn't know what to make of it. I knew that there were some tensions. But then that evening, my dad and I actually went out to the site to see it, and it was actually the entire front entrance was burned. It had vinyl siding. The vinyl siding had melted. There was still charred wood and smoke rising from the ashes. And I was about 12. Yeah, I was 12 years old when I saw that, and I realized, wow, this is a really serious manifestation of hate. This happened in Springfield, Illinois. It still is a small community. At that time, there were maybe only 50 Muslim families. They purchased a small house, converted it into a mosque. So it was the only mosque for miles. And it was sort of the hub of my Islamic social experience. All my Muslim friends, I knew of other Muslims only because of that mosque. When I went to school, I was often the only Muslim kid in the class. That was a place where I became very good at basketball. In fact, basketball was one of the reasons I really enjoyed going to Sunday school. I mean, I enjoyed the learning and everything, but basketball was a lot of fun. So it held a special place in my heart. And when I saw that, I realized, hate can turn deadly.
Muslims have been in America for a long, long time, since the founding of this nation. And then, of course, we had the big migration waves in the 60s and 70s. So, if spreading Sharia was one of our goals, are we just very slow? Or to carry out this master plan, or did someone manufacture this fear against Sharia? Why are we having this conversation right now in 2012?
Going back 10, 15 years, let alone decades, there have been negative stereotypes of Muslims or Arab Americans. But truthfully, this is the United States, and most groups have had negative stereotypes about them or jokes made at their expense. What we've seen, though, in the past 10 years has definitely been a dramatic uptick in these sort of sentiments and, if not a widespread distrust. I think what really stands out and what we need to look at is the first time that we saw real money and coordination come into this campaign against Muslims, or efforts to stoke fears against them, was in, I believe it was late September, early October of 2008, when millions of DVDs were sent to swing state voters, often in their newspapers. And the documentary was Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West. This organization, the Clarion Fund, spent $18 million distributing this film, which is a lot of money, regardless of how you look at it. It's a lot of money in the American political system. It's a lot of money to use to supposedly spread awareness about the dangers of a specific group of Americans. And just as that seemed to be dying out, and certainly whether, allegations that Obama was a Muslim, which are not true, but it wouldn't matter if he was. But this type of thing just sort of seemed like it was dying out a little bit by the time the summer of 2010 rolled around. And then we had the Cordoba Initiative's Islamic Community Center in Lower Manhattan, which was named by those who didn't want it as the Ground Zero Mosque. And really, I think in the summer of 2010, we see pundits and bloggers and and pseudo-intellectuals who had otherwise not had the bully pulpit in the mainstream media suddenly appearing on talk radio and on Fox News to share their opinions. And by the time 2011 rolls around, 2/3 of Americans who identify with the Tea Party and Americans who trust Fox News for their news source agree that the values of Islam are at odds with American values.
Part of the discourse about the threat of Sharia in Britain is that these are people who've come here and are trying to take over the system. But I think it's important to realize that we're not talking about infiltrators, we're talking about our fellow citizens. So in Britain, we're talking about British Muslims, second, third, fourth generation Muslims. And in the United States, likewise, we're talking about other Americans. And I think it does all of us a disservice to talk about them as some sort of shadowy foreign enemy. And also the fact that these are citizens making claims in the public sphere means that we need to take those seriously and evaluate them the way we evaluate other sorts of claims like this. Which is not to say that I'm an advocate for Sharia or religious law at all, but I am an advocate of people's freedom and certainly of their equal treatment in the legal system.
So I guess your family did not then come here to impose Sharia law upon the United States?
They're not, and if they did, they're failing.
They're doing really badly about it.
Yeah, they're doing a very poor job. But you know, it's such an abstract thing. Like I went to Sunday school. I didn't have a formal Islamic education where you know, I went to a full-time high school that was all Islamic or Muslim. I went to a public school. I went to Sunday school for like 2-3 hours. We would just learn the basics. And even then, Sharia was just, okay, this abstract thing, don't worry about it. It's for the scholars to figure out. It's constantly changing. What you need to worry about is the rules, how to pray, how to fast, how to treat your parents right. And so it's strange that one of the frustrating things is I feel like I have to explain things that aren't really a part of my reality anyway.
Right.
It doesn't mean I'm not practicing. I'm totally practicing, but still Sharia is not the term in my mind. When I walk home after work, it's gone. Now, it doesn't help when Sharia is twisted and misinterpreted by Muslim countries themselves. And you know, that's a phenomenon we have to acknowledge. And we've all heard the nightmare stories of Muslim women who are raped, you know, say in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, and then get charged with adultery, which is absurd, which completely, you know, that is not Sharia. That interpretation is unjust. It's immoral and wrong and doesn't belong in Sharia. But what Islamophobes do is they'll take those kind of twisted examples and say that is all that Sharia is, and that we must protect ourselves, that America must pass laws against it.
One of the most comical experiences, actually, for me, is I attended a political event not too long ago, and it was a house party in the home of a Pakistani-American family, and most of the attendees were Pakistani-American Muslims, and there were several questions asked of the candidate as to, you know, our children were born here in the United States, and they're being subjected to surveillance everywhere. They go to college, their MSAs are being followed. They're stopped at airports when they try to fly home. Well, you know, what are you, Mr. Senator, going to do about this situation? And he couldn't answer those concerns. And I heard a gentleman just say, like, no, I'm going to raise my hand. I'm not going to let this go. I want to know what you're doing, because my fear is that one of these days they're going to put something on our forehead so that people know that we're Muslim. And they're eventually going to lock us all up one day, just like they did to the Japanese. This happened to the Japanese, obviously, during World War II. And what's so shocking is the Supreme Court said, oh, you know, racial discrimination, strict scrutiny, I get it. This is the highest level of scrutiny. It's very tough to pass a law which is blatant on its face, a racist law. And yet they said, you know what, but this is the one case we're going to say the national security interests are so important to the foundations of the United States that we're even going to allow racial discrimination in the interest of national security. That's what's happening to us. It's very blatant. They're discriminating against us, and they don't care.
The average American who's afraid and misinformed of Islam and Muslims is not an Islamophobe. You know, most people have 9-to-5 jobs. They're not going to go and take a class on Islam or Muslims. You know, so So I don't fault them. Who I do fault are the career individuals. You know, somebody like Frank Gaffney, for example, he was very big during the Red Scare, during the communist Red Scare. Fear-mongering is all he knows how to do. That's his skill. It's a terrible skill. As far as I'm concerned, he's not worth, his skills aren't worth anything to society, but that's what he knows how to do. Obviously the communist scare is over, so this is the only thing he knows how to do, and so he's doing it with Islam and Muslims.
You were asked how you feel about the Islamophobes, and I feel like you held yourself back.
I held myself back.
Tell us what you really think.
Well, I certainly dislike them because, you know, it's like a schoolyard fight. Well, they started it.
Yeah.
You know, they started picking on me first. But whenever I think about this, I know I'm going to repeat myself. Whenever I think about this long term, you know, they are going to be defeated, and I'm here because I want to be part of that process. I don't want to sit on the sidelines. I want them to know that they lost because it's something that we had to do.
I'm not as confident as you are about their defeat or the timeliness of it. You know, we look at American history, and I think you made an excellent point. African Americans have been in the United States since 1619.
It's a long time.
You know, and have they achieved equality now, 400 years later? Like, yeah, probably not. And I don't think it'll take 400 years. They also don't think it'll take.
It's probably not going to be 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, and I think about, like, you know, by the time President Obama was candidate Obama, the inquiry was less, I mean, there still was an issue about, you know, his blackness, his African American identity or his African identity. Right. And I've got to say, this guy formerly lived in West Virginia, so I remember those exit polls where people even acknowledged, you know, we're lifelong Democrats, we just can't vote for a black guy. And if that's what they're telling the pollsters, you know, it was bad. But think about how much, the bigger deal was that his middle name was Hussein. Of course, nobody mentioned the fact that his first name is Barack. Right,
which is also a Muslim name. He won't say it, but
see, maybe it's a Jewish name, which kind of tells you why
it's kind of both,
the conflict is a little mythical. And I want to make an important distinction here that in opposing an anti-Sharia movement, this does not mean that CAIR is pro-Sharia. And it certainly does not mean that CAIR is pro-Sharia the way it's practiced in some parts of the Muslim majority world. Truthfully, Muslims feel differently about this, right? Some people are very observant of their faith, and particularly on practices and a code of conduct. In America, in a religiously pluralistic society, those people need to be protected, and they cannot be called out, they cannot be condemned by their government for practicing their faith. And that's something we absolutely say. But of course, we've got the anti-Muslim bashers who say, we want Sharia law to take over the United States. I'm not saying I'm for Sharia. I'm saying I'm opposed to a bill that calls Muslims out. It says that we are evil and that we cannot be trusted, we cannot be tolerated, we must be expelled from this society, and the people who practice the faith are particularly dangerous. I mean, that's just such a sinister ideal that, first of all, I mean, there are two different things. One is this belief that if you dress a certain way, if you pray in a certain ritualistic manner, if you pray a certain amount of times per day, you attend a mosque a certain amount of times, that has a direct relationship to how religious you feel on the inside. I mean, it sometimes does, it sometimes doesn't. It's very complicated for all people in all religious communities. But also that because you pray 5 times a day, you are a threat to national security? That's just bogus. I mean, that's preposterous. So I wanted to make that distinction, because there are people who are opposing this bill because they personally, you know, they live their lives in accordance to Sharia law. I do not, and yet I'm as opposed to this bill, or even more opposed than anyone I know. And I think I spoke about that previously and why it's such a personal issue for me. Because I know this is not really about the observance of the faith. People are saying it is. They say it's not anti-Muslim, it's about people who practice Islam. It's not. It's about the people with the brown skin, the funny names. And they're foreign and they're dangerous and they're taking over our country. And that's what this is about. We've seen this before. We've seen this so many times. How many times do we need to see this movie over and over again before we realize how it's going to end? And I've seen this so many times. People who I have known for a decade or longer, learning I'm Muslim, and now they can't return my calls.
I see, yeah.
And you know, and we've talked about this. I mean, they're people, they're elected officials who, and their first thing was like, wait, why do you care about this? Oh, you're not Muslim, are you? And now all of a sudden they're not taking the calls, and I'm thinking, you know, we work together. I taught you, you know, what a reasonable seizure is. You know, we've tried cases together, but I mean, that hate is, you know, it's much.
It's gonna last long.
It's much more prevalent than people think. It's very mainstream. It's accepted, and you mentioned LGBT equality, because I think about my background working in that field, and you know, 30 years ago it was very mainstream to hate gays. Now you're a social pariah. You know, you're an outcast if you do that, and it's still very mainstream, and you win public approval and public support by hating Muslims. I want to get to that place where people realize this is not okay.
Exactly. I think we might get there in 20 to 30 years, but the actual effects of the products of Islamophobia are going to last long.
Right.
I mean, you've got a young child. I hope to have a young child one day, and I think maybe these anti-Muslim organizations might be gone. They might be shut down. Or they'll be much smaller than they are now. They might even be called something else entirely. But the effects of law enforcement training, for example, think of the legacy of law enforcement in the African American community. It just doesn't end. It doesn't change.
It won't go away.
And you know, the fact is, a lot of cops might not be racist now, but a
lot of cops may not recognize.
Right, but that psyche and legacy has lasted. And I think, you know, from you know, if I have a child growing up, is he or she going to have experiences from not just police, but FBI, airport security, things like that? Is that a permanent institutionalized thing? And is this going to be a generational product that keeps going on?
The sad reality of American society and American politics is that we change when we see how evil hate is. You know, when people showed segregated schools in the South on national television, people were moved. They were like, yeah, that doesn't seem right. But when people saw police putting fire hoses and dogs on protesters who were just trying to sit at a lunch counter, then they saw how evil hate was. When people showed grown adults throwing rocks at school buses full of African American children, adults attacking children violently because of the color of skin, then they saw hate. When the Japanese were actually locked up in internment camps, that's when Americans saw the hate, and that's when they saw the injustice. And they're not going to see the injustice because we're standing, you know, I love this video. I love the press conference. I love everything we're doing. But that really doesn't change things. I mean, it doesn't. And I've spoken before about, you know, in the aftermath of Brown v. Board, my family was living in Virginia. And of course, we know that Virginia was one of the most effective and most troublingly effective states in the massive resistance movement. The last federal court ruling desegregating public schools in Virginia, 1971. 1971. In the 1970s, Virginia finally desegregated their public schools. And that was, I'm not very good at math. I'm gonna say 20-ish because I'm bad at math. I think it's 18. I don't know, 20-ish years after Brown v. Board. And we're talking about a legacy of slavery that now is 400 years old. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. American Muslims, I hate to tell this to you, but.
America has a way of fixing itself. We're not quite sure how it happens, but it does. You know, we have the freedom. I'm here speaking. We have freedom of speech. We have the tools to fix it. And, you know, but that takes time. So I'm not worried about Islamophobes long term. Are they annoying? Are they a nuisance right now? Absolutely. And I congratulate them on being a nuisance right now. But that's all they are, and that's all they'll ever be.